Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, 45th anniversary of one of my favorite games of 2017, and quite possibly the game with the most complex narrative in the history of gaming. I will be talking about my thoughts on NieR Automata, which is a game that I absolutely adored when I first played it towards the end of 2017. I remember thinking of it as an all-time great game. But with that being a time that was still towards the beginning of my re-interest in the gaming medium, I have since gone on to play a vast range of games, particularly ones that have come out over the course of this last generation, to the point where now, years down the road, I kind of forgot exactly why I loved this game as much as I did. And I also think it got to the point where I remembered my annoyances with the game more than things I actually really loved. And I never did get around to replaying NieR Automata until now. And here on the replay, I think I love the game even more than I did before. I think it is a game that I've grown so much respect for, especially now with the added context of knowing the NieR series a bit more, having now played NieR Replicant and having done a decent amount of research on the series. I'm coming out of this playthrough with an even higher opinion of NieR Automata and the series as a whole. Now, like my normal retrospectives, I will be running through the game from beginning to end, but I do like to start off with more general thoughts here, especially pertaining to the gameplay. And this game does play similarly to NieR Replicant. It is still an action JRPG with a hack and slash based combat system, and you also having a companion that follows you that allows you to have ranged attacks, though this time instead of having magic being shot out by books, here we have lasers being shot out by pods, which can be upgraded with special attacks that can be bought at shops. Though to be honest, I never really spent that much time customizing my pods in this game. Another slight change here is the chip system, which does work similarly to the words from Replicant, though here I did end up spending a lot more time customizing my layout, and I did really like how the system was integrated with there being a certain amount of storage, and you can buy more storage through the shops, and that leading to having a wider range of chips equipped that lead to stat boost or potential special abilities. But these chips also affect what you see in your HUD, and you can customize your HUD through it, which really does end up playing into this game's themes, where this game does get extremely meta, where a lot of the systems that are within this game are real in-game, like even the menus and the settings and again the HUD, like these are all things that are fictionalized versions of what the character is seeing or experiencing, which is a really interesting element of this game. Another example of this is when you die, like what you've gained since your last save ends up getting left behind on that dead body, as the in-game explanation is that you're now in a new body as playing as an android, and you can find your original body and get your items back. So to get that stuff back, you have to go and find your original body, and like that's something that would typically annoy me. I know other games do this sort of thing, and it does annoy me in those games. But for a game like Automata, I do really feel like it fits with the overall themes of the game. Now, like Replicant, the camera does shift at points, going from your standard third-person 3D perspective to sometimes having a side-scrolling or overhead view. Now, in my Replicant video, I did compare portions of that game's combat to that of a bullet hell shooter, to which this game also has those elements, but there are also literal shoot-'em-up sections where you play within a flying unit and you shoot down machines that are around you. It literally just plays like a shmup at that point. Now, over the course of the entire game, you do end up playing as 3 different characters, each playing slightly differently. 2B plays the most similarly to what we saw in Replicant. She does have 2 weapons that can be used for light and heavy attacks. A2 plays similarly as well, though she does have the ability to go into berserk mode, which increases her attack power by sacrificing health. And then we also have 9S, who does play a bit differently, where he does only have 1 weapon, and the other button is used to hack into enemies. That does lead to a mini game that again also plays similarly to a shmup, that if you do succeed, it does deal a massive amount of damage, though failing at these ends up damaging you instead. And these minigames do range from being like extremely easy to be brutally difficult based around the strength of your opponent. They also end up playing a major factor in the main story as well, with this hacking system being what these androids are actually seeing, and there being many points in the game where 9S needs to hack into something to progress the narrative. which again at points can be annoying, but it really does add to the overall immersion of how this world functions here. The final more general thing I want to talk about is that, like in Replicant, we do have multiple endings. However, in this one, we have 26 endings, one for each letter of the alphabet. Now, only endings A through E are like the true canon important endings, which we will obviously be talking about later, but the majority of the rest of them are just joke endings that occur if you like mess up your objective. And again, this feels like a really meta element of the game. It pretty much just feels like the developers just mocking your incompetence. Though there is also another special ending in Ending Y, which does get interesting as it does involve Emil, one of the only recurring characters from the previous game. And you can end up having like a secret boss battle with him, which is a cool callback, especially for a game here that has very few direct connections between installments. But I'll be honest, I didn't actually go for this ending myself. But now let's talk about the narrative, which I did adore the first time around, but I do feel like my appreciation for it has gone up significantly during the replay here. I do think that having this added context of Replicant and knowing more about the lore of the series just gives me more of a general respect for the themes, the complexity, and the uniqueness of what Yoko Toro's narratives do. And something that I didn't even realize until I was replaying this, and kind of blew my mind, is the fact that this takes place over 8,000 years after the events of Replicant. That's completely insane to have that massive of a time skip in between games. But I do think that also just adds to this like really grand scale of the series' timeline. And I think it also opens it up for having a wide range of mysteries of what happened in the time in between the two games. But yeah, I mean, this game does take place in the year 11,945, where we do play as Yora androids who are in a proxy war fighting for the remnants of humanity against some machines made by alien invaders, with again the creators of both of these groups not even being present in the war itself, with both having supposedly left Earth in the past, with the humans supposedly being based on the moon, which is a cool mystery that ends up unraveling over the course of this game in a pretty satisfying way. But let's start running through the game itself, obviously starting with Route A, which shows the initial story from the perspective of 2B, who does come off as this calm, cold character that acts as a nice foil to 9S's like over-the-top optimism. And seeing these two characters bond over the course of this first playthrough was pretty endearing, though obviously it is recontextualized afterwards. Now the game is broken up into chapters, with Chapter 1 obviously introducing us to the world and characters. We are instantly thrown into combat, first with a shoot 'em up section, and then afterwards with a more standard combat section that ends with a boss battle against a giant saw. We do meet up with 9S and investigate the abandoned factory until we reach our next boss battle, one against a Goliath, which leads to more shoot 'em up sections. And overall, I did really like this as a set piece to start the game, especially with it ending with 2B and 9S using their black boxes to cause this massive explosion that ends up killing them both, only for them to awaken in the bunker, really setting up the rules of how this world functions. And afterwards, we do get to change our settings, which is played up as 2B having to readjust her own settings, which again really adds to the meta-ness of the game. Chapter 1 does end with us getting our commands from the commander that leads to us returning to Earth for Chapter 2, which revolves around us traveling through the city ruins, which does kind of serve as a hub world for this game, with the surrounding areas feeling like their own distinct areas that spawn off from it. Eventually we do find the resistance camp where we meet their leader, Anemone, who is there throughout the game, and we do interact with her quite a bit, but I don't really feel like she adds much to the story. I do also find the concept of this resistance to be kind of weird, considering how you would assume that this resistance would be like the remaining humans left on Earth or something to that nature, but in reality they're just these older non-Yora androids, with again every character that you end up interacting with over the course of this game pretty much being an android. But also at this camp we do for the first time encounter shops within the open world, and you are forced to do a couple tedious tasks for the vendors there before continuing on, though it doesn't really bother me too much as it does add to the world building and they do act as tutorials. Afterwards, you are tasked with heading to the desert to wipe out some machines, which leads us to Chapter 3, taking place entirely in the desert, which is a cool area of you being able to slide down sand dunes, but overall the initial mission itself does start off kind of tedious with you just wiping out groups of machines until one of them starts to run away, to which we start to see our first glimpse into these machines starting to grow human emotions, which is obviously a massive theme throughout this game, though one that is kind of generic, but one that does fit the narrative. Following this, we do have our first interaction with Adam, an android creation of the machine network, which is a cool boss battle where he continuously levels up as the battle progresses, and I do think that Adam and later Eve are fantastic villains, as they do bring a bit of a strange dynamic to the game, though there is a lot of mysterious tone surrounding them that makes them pretty compelling characters. We followed that up with Chapter 4, which is probably one of the more notable set pieces for me, taking place in the amusement park as we search for some missing androids, and this area has a radically different tone to the rest of the game, with it feeling pretty lively, despite the fact that the world has turned into a post-apocalyptic battleground. It also has some fun sections like platforming across rides, and we have a combat section on top of a roller coaster, but this all leads up to a boss battle against Simone, which has numerous phases, including the first appearance of the hacking minigame, but immediately after her defeat, we do start Chapter 5, where we meet up with a robot that ends up taking us to his village, where we do meet Pascal, who is an interesting character, being the leader of these pacifist robots, and probably being the most prominent side character in the game. Also, while in this village, you can interact with numerous machines that are there that further perpetuate this theme of machines having identity, with there being discussions about books and philosophy. Also, just in general, philosophy is a very important element to this game, with a lot of older philosophers being the naming conventions for the majority of the characters here. But afterwards, we do get a fetch quest that involves returning to the resistance camp and then back to the village, which kind of feels pointless, though it does show that the machines and androids can work together peacefully. But after that task, we do learn about an attack in the city ruins, where you have to fight against another Goliath on top of a skyscraper, and it's a fine boss battle, but one that kind of blends into these other boss battles throughout the game that play very similarly. After that, we do end up encountering Adam and Eve, where we do get a pretty massive lore dump from them, where they talk about their creators and how they're already dead, and we end up having a fight against them. Again, like, all this is pretty strong. I do really like this section of the game. It really does add this really ominous feeling that you get from Adam and Eve, while also giving you further background on what's going on here. After that, we get around to Chapter 6, which involves us returning to Pascal, where we do learn about the Forest Kingdom, which is another area that has a pretty distinct tone to it. And the castle itself is a pretty interesting side-scrolling labyrinth where you have to find your way to the top. I did really like that shake-up in the gameplay. Along the way, you do also fight some machines who constantly talk about protecting their king. And at the top of the castle, we do find that king, who turns out to be a machine toddler, who out of nowhere gets murdered by A2, a rogue Yora android, who we do end up having a boss battle with. And afterwards, she does end up leaving, giving us a warning that makes us think that not everything is as it seems with Yora, though realistically, A2 really doesn't play that major of a role in the story until Route C, which kind of makes her appearance here pretty jarring, as again, she doesn't really appear again chronologically until the events of that playthrough. Now, I do feel like I should also mention that this is also the chapter where Emile does show up very briefly in the main story. And while, again, as I mentioned earlier, there is an ending Y that does greatly involve him, there are side quests, but in terms of the main story, he doesn't really end up doing anything here. Now, Chapter 7 does involve us heading for the Flooded City, another pretty cool and distinct locale that does involve some platforming across flooded buildings, but most of this section is spent in combat, first on the ground, and that is followed by a pretty lengthy flying unit section that ends with a boss battle that, once again, kind of blends in with the numerous similar boss battles in this portion of the game, though this one does eventually get around to really feeling like you're playing a bullet hell shooter with so much stuff going on. Though narratively, this does progress the story forward, as after the fight, most of the androids involved in the fight have now disappeared, including 9S. So 2B does have to get a scanner in order to find them, and to do so, she does return to the resistance camp, where we do have our first interaction with Devila and Popola, who are not the same Devila and Popola from Replicant, but it was cool to see them involved in the story here, though their real importance doesn't come into play until, again, Route C. But eventually we do find a hidden passageway leading to the copied city. This black and white city that turns out to be this construct of atoms that he ends up using to learn about humanity. And it is here that we get our final fight with him, to which 2B ends up killing him in a pretty brutal way. We do also end up rescuing 9S, but we do have to continue without him afterwards as he needs time to recuperate, leading us to Chapter 9, where now we have to return to the abandoned factory and meet up with Pascal, eventually encountering this machine cult, and we end up having to escape the factory alongside Pascal, to which we are eventually helped by 9S remotely as he ends up hacking into a machine to open the path. Overall, this section does have some pretty interesting level design, but I'll be honest, I did feel like a lot of it was kind of filler and really doesn't have that much impact on Route A. I feel like it is a lot more integral in Route B. But with that, we do get the Chapter 10, the final chapter of Route A, that does mostly revolve around Eve. Now mad with grief over Adam's death, he does command the machines to attack, leading to us having a massive series of fights back to back to back. First at the resistance camp, which has now been overrun, and then following that up with a series of boss battles, one involving like a massive rolling ball, and another one that is like a snake-like conglomerate of machines. And both these fights I did find pretty annoying. If it wasn't for me having the chip that allowed me to automatically heal, I probably would have died during these sections quite a bit, but obviously that did help me out. Now this does obviously lead to the final boss battle of this playthrough, facing off against Eve, who I will say is voice acted by Ray Chase, and he really gives a fantastic, really maniacal performance here, with him really coming off as this crazy person. But the fight itself is at first your traditional fight, though as the fight progresses, a dust storm gets stronger and stronger, and Eve does end up flying around the battlefield. I did find this section of the fight kind of annoying, as I found it pretty difficult to find him at points, and considering he has a good chunk of health, this section really just took me forever to complete. And also in the end stretch of the fight, 2B and 9S end up getting injured, with them only having the ability to use ranged attacks and them having slower movement. And through the ridiculous number of projectiles that Eve ends up coming at you with at quick succession, I did find this section to be kind of difficult, particularly in Route B for me, where even with the auto heal chip, it really doesn't heal quick enough at some points, and you do still end up dying despite that, which did get kind of annoying, especially considering the checkpoint is all the way back to around the halfway point in the fight. But after you get through that, 2B does end up brutally killing Eve, but along the way, 9S ends up getting affected with Eve's virus, forcing 2B to tragically kill 9S as well, making this a really bittersweet ending to Route A here, with it seeming like the world is going to return to normal. And kind of like Replicant's Route A, I do think this works well enough as an individual story. I think if you take it at face value, it is fine. But obviously future playthroughs do add a significant amount of context and just straight up more story that does really expand it in a satisfying way. Now I will say that Route A here is actually really short. I mean, the runtime of each of these like individual playthroughs is probably around like 5 to 6 hours if you rush through it, which is significantly shorter than that of like NieR Replicant, and really much shorter than what you would expect from most modern games. But I do think for a game like this, where you have to re-experience certain sections of the game multiple times, I do think having shorter base playthroughs ends up working out for it. And I really do feel like the multiple playthrough element of this game is handled much better than it was in Replicant, where in Replicant I did feel like it got super repetitive at a point, even by the time of Route B. While here for me, I never felt like we were really completely retreading the same exact content, as I do feel like they made significant changes between playthroughs that wasn't as much there in Replicant. But with that, let's talk about Route B, which is essentially us playing through the same events as Route A, but this time through the perspective of 9S, who was obviously alongside 2B for most of those events. But there are some pretty major differences here, especially with us getting to see what 9S was doing while they were separated. We do also get some added context with more scenes showing the machines, getting to see their point of view, and we also see more of Adam and Eve along the way. But it really is the change in gameplay at points that does make this feel really fresh. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, 9S does play differently than the other characters, with more of a focus on hacking, and you needing to do a lot of hacking over the course of this playthrough. Now, since most of Route B is technically the same as Route A, I'll mainly be talking about the differences here instead of just running through the entire story again. I mean, this playthrough does actually start with you playing as a random machine whose brother has been killed and you try to bring him back to life. Again, really playing on this theme of humanity. After you shift control to 9S right before he ends up meeting with 2B at the beginning of Route A, where we do get a pretty lengthy section that introduces us to the hacking system before facing off against the Goliath once again. And while it can be annoying to technically be doing these boss battles again, they do end up playing pretty differently, again because of the abundance of hacking involved. After Chapter 1, most of the game does play out pretty similarly, again with the exception of these really minor new scenes being added along the way. The playthrough does really diverge though after Chapter 7, as that is when 9S gets kidnapped by Adam, taking us to Chapter 8 that ends up taking place entirely in 9S's memory bank, which does play pretty similarly to the hacking sections, but here you do have to find your way through a labyrinth, and along the way you can see some of 9S's inner thoughts, including the fact that he wants to blank 2B, which I do think is an interesting moment here. Again, I think there's obviously a very easy assumption to be made here of what it is, but I do think when you go beyond that initial assumption, I do think the possibilities here of what 9S is thinking here, especially with the context that we find out later on about the relationship between 2B and 9S, I do think this leads to this being a pretty interesting scene in retrospect. The chapter does end though by him getting saved by 2B as he did in the copied city, and Chapter 9 takes place while he was recuperating and involves a lot of hacking, as we do see the events that lead up to 9S helping 2B in the factory. And I did find this section to be pretty annoying as well. I mean, during the section, again, you're hacking into these machines, remote controlling them through some really awkward platforming and combat sections, and it really does go on for a bit too long for my liking. But narratively, this section does have a pretty massive reveal here, in that it turns out that the story about humanity being on the moon is fake, with humanity having actually been extinct since even before the alien invasion, and that Yora keeps up this facade that humanity still exists in order to give the androids something to fight for, which is a revelation that I absolutely adore. I really do love a lot of the philosophy that is involved within this as well, this concept of purpose and God and all these things that are involved here. I do really like how it is handled, and does recontextualize a good chunk of the narrative here. And I'll be honest, I actually kind of forgot this twist coming into my replay. While I definitely remembered that, yeah, something was up here, I didn't remember the exact plot twist itself, so I did feel like that may have played into how much I enjoyed it here on the replay. But after Chapter 9 there, Chapter 10 ends up playing out pretty similarly, with the exception of us getting the revelation that 9S has survived those events, and that leads us to Route C, which takes us immediately after the events of Routes A and B. And I really love how this third playthrough is handled here, with it essentially being a sequel to the previous playthroughs, which is kind of insane when you think about it. It really took me by surprise the first time I played it, and I think it is a way better way to structure the game than how these multiple playthroughs were handled in Replicant, with this essentially being a brand new playthrough. It's not you just doing the same thing over and over and over again. But this playthrough does start off with Chapter 11, which really shows the downfall of Yora. I mean, here we do have 2B and 9S continuing their jobs on Earth after the fight with Eve, which again, initially from Route A, we assume that, oh, things are going to be peaceful from now on. This is a happy ending. Again, turns out it's not. A logic virus ends up corrupting every Yora unit, and we have to play as 2B as all of her android allies end up turning against her, We then also have to play as 9S, as he has to defend 2B and hack into her to get rid of the virus. Afterwards, 2B and 9S end up escaping to the bunker, only to find out that the androids there are infected as well. And we do try to escape with the commander until we find out that she is also infected. And I did really love this entire sequence. It really just shows how dire the situation is now. But afterwards, we do have 2B and 9S escaping, only for 2B to end up crash landing in the flooded city. And this next mission was one that I really hated when I first played the game. And it involves us having to play as this damaged 2B as the virus is starting to corrupt her, and she needs to reach the other side of the city before it ends up happening. And I remember just failing this section over and over and over again during my first playthrough. And to be honest, I don't even exactly remember why, considering, again, this time I did it in my first try. So again, it's kind of funny that this was like a mission that always lingered in my mind, despite the fact that it's actually not that difficult. I mean, I still did have some trouble on the replay, but again, I got it first try, so it isn't that bad in the grand scheme of things, but I still do fundamentally find this mission kind of annoying. But once 2B reaches her destination, she is found by A2, to which 2B ends up uploading her memories to her sword, passing it on to A2, while also telling her to look after 9S, and immediately afterwards, A2 mercifully kills her, only for 9S to see them, and in turn vow revenge against her. And the chapter ends with the two being separated as the machines build a tower that ends up being a focal point for the rest of the story. But this is obviously a major turning point for the narrative here. Again, the death of 2B was something that I was very surprised to see when I originally played the game, and for them to change the protagonist role to A2, again, a very minor character before these events, is a pretty big surprise, but I do feel like it's also a really fitting one. Like, it is a sad farewell here to 2B, though. I do overall like how it was handled, and I do like how it progresses 9S's arc moving forward. Overall, I do really like Chapter 11 here, as, again, I've always been a big fan of these conflicts that end with the protagonist losing, and them ending up in their massive low point, and I do feel like this is obviously a massive example of that. But moving forward, we do end up flipping back and forth between A2 and 9S as the playable character, with chapters 12 and 14 following A2 and chapters 13 and 15 following 9S. First, let's talk about chapters 12 and 14, where again we do play as A2, who I do think comes off as a pretty likable character by the end of these chapters. I mean, while she is this pretty generically stern loner at the beginning of this, I did like her interactions with her pod and her overall connection to 2B. That did make her a lot more interesting to me. Chapter 12 is a bit of a short chapter, though. It's really one that feels like more setup than anything, with us getting to know the character and it ending with a boss battle against this massive mech. That is another section that I remembered hating when I first played the game. I remember really struggling through this fight, as at the time I was like really under leveled and I didn't have many items with me. So I remember this section in particular taking me forever to finish, even when like turning on all the auto chips that allow the game to essentially play for itself. Like, I remember even dying during that. But here, again, during my replay, it ended up being a lot easier here. Afterwards, chapter 14 involves A2's interactions with Pascal, where he does help her repair her fuel filter, and she does gain some sympathy for the machines along the way. But then we find out that these cannibalistic machines have attacked Pascal's village, which again is really depressing to see, this like peaceful village now in ruins. And afterwards we find Pascal at the factory, where we have to defend the village's children by controlling a Goliath in order to fight another one. And this was another fight that I remember for some reason having some difficulty with in my first playthrough, though obviously this time it's like, again, it's very simple. It's really just you timing your attacks. And really, like, all these annoying sections that I've talked about from Route C, like, those are the major annoyances I remembered from my previous playthrough. And with each of them going really smoothly here on the replay, it definitely has given me a more positive outlook on the game as a whole. But immediately after this, we do have another pretty depressing moment happen, where we do return to the children, only to find out that they have committed suicide out of fear, which leads to Pascal asking us to wipe his memory due to his guilt, which is essentially the end of the Pascal we have gone to know over the course of the narrative here. But again, also really plays into this theme of these machines having humanity, which again is a prominent theme throughout the game. Next up, we do have chapters 13 and 15 having us play as 9S, who grows increasingly unstable over the course of these chapters, being consumed by his lust for revenge and his hatred of machines. But the section does start with 9S awakening, having been saved by Devila and Popola, who now play a much bigger role in the story moving forward, with them being the only ones that can repair 9S, now that he's without the help of Yora, and they end up helping him get into the tower. Now, gameplay-wise, this section is just kind of fine. I mean, it's mostly you having to go to these recovery units in order to get keys that will eventually allow you to enter the main tower. Now, the first of these units is in the forest, where we encounter a decent amount of combat sections as we climb to the top. The second one is in the flooded city, where in that one we have numerous hacking challenges that do get kind of annoying. And through these sections, we do get additional lore. The most notable, which to me is the fact that it turns out that the black boxes that the androids have been using are made of the same material that the machines are made of. Essentially meaning that, again, these two groups who are fighting against each other over the course of the entire story are fighting each other despite how similar they are. And it really just shows how pointless this entire conflict is. But again, outside of these little tidbits here and there, these sections don't do that much narratively. But beyond this, we do get to Chapter 16, where we play as both characters going back and forth as we head towards the third and final unit at the amusement park, where we do have a boss battle against the commander and some machines. We do also get our first confrontation between A2 and 9S, but really nothing of true consequence happens until Chapter 17, the final chapter in the game, where first we do end up playing as 9S as he hacks his way into the tower, and while we do get attacked by some machines, Devila and Popola end up helping us open the door and end up sacrificing themselves along the way, which felt like a pretty satisfying outcome for them, later knowing about the guilt that they felt from dooming humanity back in the first game. We then see A2 enter the tower as well, and we do switch between the two characters as they progress through the tower, during which we do get some pretty cool revelations along the way, including more context behind the creation of Yora and how it was made to perpetuate this myth of humanity so that this internal cycle of war can continue, which again, the cycle of violence is obviously a major theme over the course of this narrative. We also have this really great reveal that really recontextualizes pretty much everything, where it turns out that 2B is in reality Model 2E, being an executioner model that was assigned to kill 9S whenever he discovers the truth about humanity, which he has done numerous times in the past, kind of playing into the words that 2B says at the end of Route A, where she says it always ends like this. And I really like how this recontextualizes this. Now, on the way up the tower, we do have some boss battles that are mostly just fine. I mean, there's this pretty big one where we just switch back and forth between the two characters. But again, by this point in the game, I was kind of more interested in what was going on narratively than anything the gameplay could really give us, as again, it mostly just felt like more of the same. But eventually we do get to A2 and 9S meeting at the top of the tower, and here we do get the choice of who to play as. Picking A2 does give us ending C here, while picking 9S gets us ending D. And I did like how this final boss battle here plays differently depending on who you pick, not even just in the sense that you're playing as a different character, but also in the type of boss battle that you get. Ending C is more of a standard boss battle where you fight in a 3D environment, though you do have to counter 9S's hacking at points. But this ending does end with A2 saving 9S and sacrificing herself in order to destroy the tower, which is probably one of the more satisfying outcomes for this story. Ending D has us playing as this now really insane 9S who has been consumed by the virus, and we end up having this 2D side-scrolling fight that encourages you to use the hacking system and plays pretty radically differently here, but also ends in a completely different way as well, with the two androids here ending up killing each other in the fight, only for us to find out afterwards that the tower itself is actually being used to fire an arc containing the machine's memories in order to find a new world. And through some text, we do have the choice of having 9S end up joining them, which is an ending that didn't really do that much for me, but it does show this never-ending cycle of violence that ends up leading to ending E, which is extremely meta, where after finishing ending C and D, the pods end up giving us the option to delete the URL data in order to have this shoot 'em up section involving destroying the real life credits, essentially destroying the creators of the game, which is a pretty difficult task that eventually leads to you being helped out by other players that have played the game in order to finally defeat the creators of the game. And we do get this cutscene with the pods where we do see that the protagonists have been revived and are given the opportunity to start over, being able to live on their own and forge their own future. And afterwards, we are asked to sacrifice our save data in order to help out the other players that are out there in a similar way to the ones that just helped us out. And again, this is really meta. Again, this is the type of ending you would expect from a Yoko Taro game, really booning this theme of humanity and sacrifice. And I get it. I get what this is doing, but I'll be honest, I didn't sacrifice my save data. I said no. Yes, I do get the story it's trying to tell. Yes, I do get the lesson it's trying to give to the player, but I don't need that lesson. I think I'm good. I'd rather have my save data, even though, again, I know it completely goes against the lesson you're supposed to learn over the course of this game. But with that does wrap up my thoughts on NieR Automata. Again, I did really grow an immense amount of respect for the game here on the replay, especially from a narrative perspective. I mean, I don't know if there is a single game that has as complex of a narrative as this game does. Like, it's a game that really plays around with the gaming medium in a pretty significant way. And this game really dives into the themes that the series has always covered, but goes even beyond that by adding this greater focus on the player themselves being a part of the game. And I think through that, it's essentially a story that can only be told in the gaming medium due to how it plays with the player's expectations in a way that I don't think I've ever seen in any other game. And even beyond that grander look on the game of like how it handles people's perceptions of a game, I also think the more personal story that the game tells of these characters of 2B, 9S, and A2 is really incredible as well. With all of them, despite being androids, still being these pretty complex figures. I did really like the amount of mystery that the story involves as well. Like, I really love almost everything about this game's narrative. And through my experience having just played the NieR Replicant remake and now my replay of this game, it's made me grow appreciation for the series as a whole, made me grow appreciation for the work of Yoko Taro. As I do just really love the way that Yoko Taro presents his stories and how well thought out and complex they really are. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on NieR Automata 5 years after its initial release. Obviously, stay tuned for more game reviews, retrospectives, rankings down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.